Let's talk a little bit about group cohesion. Group cohesion, team cohesion, lots of times it's called chemistry, things like that. It's really just a dynamic process that's going to be reflected in the tendency for a group to stick together or remain sort of as one while they're pursuing goals and objectives. Their major types are based upon whether you're talking about task or the social categories, but really what brings people together is kind of the starting point for looking at group cohesion. What brings people together? Is it the job to accomplish, or is it the actual relationships of the group? Again, keep in mind there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. It's going to vary based upon the group. A task cohesion is the degree to which the members of the team, whether that's an athletic team or a kind of a sport business based team, work together to achieve a specific and identifiable goal. If you go back to something like The Last Dance and think about the 1990 Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen worked really well together. They weren't necessarily the greatest of friends, but their task cohesion was extremely high, and it worked out really well for those particular teams. Social cohesion is the degree to which members of a team really like each other, and there's that sense of personal satisfaction that sort of is the result of being on a team, but also being on that team, working with those people. One of the things that we've seen in modern business is that social cohesion is extremely powerful, to the point that if social cohesion is strong enough, many people will actually stay at that job as compared to moving to a job that has a higher salary. It's that important in terms of quality of life for a lot of different employees. There are a lot of different ways to measure cohesion, especially if you're thinking about on a sport-based team. There's two basic approaches, a direct and an indirect approach, which is really very, commonsensical if you think about it. A direct approach is usually bring kind of a consulting group or some industrial and organizational psychologists or a sports psychologist in, and they just ask athletes direct questions about how they like playing on the team, how well they work well with people. And there's usually a number of these questions, and you go through and you just look and you kind of let the numbers speak for themselves. Indirect is a little bit different. Use what's called a sociogram, where you can kind of chart out everything, and there's a picture of a sociogram there in the bottom right of this particular slide. But you ask team members to really indicate how they feel or how they engage or how often they communicate, or the level and effectiveness of communication with other folks on the team. And really, again, kind of the same approach as with the direct approach. What you do is you take the scores, the mathematical scores, and you generate a measure of team cohesion. And then from there, that sort of serves as the basis for, okay, now what we need to do is we need to increase our team cohesion, or maybe we need to maintain our cohesion as a group. And so that's really, it's about gathering information in a particular way using a specific approach so that you know where you are in terms of that environment, that team. Continue with this idea of research and really looking at something like team or group cohesion. We know that research has addressed team cohesion, and it's looked at both the individual and team performance, right? And so that's something that's really important as well, and something when we talk about chemistry and when we talk about cohesion and building a tight-knit group is, how does the individual and the team sort of coexist? And so as you're going through, whether it's a direct or an indirect measure of team or social cohesion, you're going to look at individual performance. And we know that increased social cohesion on a team, usually it correlates, right? So it usually is associated with increased individual effort and individual performance, with the old adage that a better team makes for a better individual performer, whether that's in terms of sales or whether that's in terms of athletic performance. Team performance does have an impact as well, or it's going to be impacted as well, because we know that either increased or decreased social cohesion is going to be associated with increased or decreased measurable team performance, whether this is wins and losses or other sport-based metrics. All right, being able to see how the individual performs and being able to see how the team performs, those are going to have a reciprocal impact on one another. And that's going to be able to really be highlighted in research when you're looking at developing that team cohesion. Some of the consequences of team cohesion in terms of, let's talk about the individual outcome. We know that team cohesion is going to be associated with usually better behavioral outcomes. It's going to be associated, as we just talked about, usually with better performance outcomes, whether this is absolute or relative, right? So a relative performance outcome might be you got better today as compared to yesterday. And an absolute is if you have different sales metrics that you have to hit regardless, even if you've increased, you have that sales metric. So that's kind of the difference there. But regardless, those absolute or relative performance outcomes tend to be associated with team cohesion. Also, the psychological wellness of the individual. When people tend to have better moods, they tend to have a better grasp of their emotions when the team or the business setting that they're a part of is one that is considered cohesive. It's very, very powerful. The group outcome, stability and climate. We were just talking about the psychological wellness of the individual tends to be associated with that climate. But I also think team stability is interesting because if you have a good place, you have a good team, a good place to work, people tend to, there's going to be change, that's inevitable, but people tend to stay longer. And again, the absolute and the relative performance of the entire team is going to be trending in a positive way. And then there's greater group self-efficacy. And this is the idea that the group can achieve whatever it needs to be achieving. So maybe even being able to pivot as a lot of sales folks did during the middle of the pandemic and be able to still engage potential stakeholders and consumers and clients. And what all of that does is if you still feel good about what it is that you're doing, then the group can absorb disruptive events, so a lot of acrimony on the team. It can kind of absorb that, but even in a bit more of a proactive way, it sort of inhibits that acrimony from developing. So again, team cohesion really brings together folks, and those that don't buy into the culture of that particular group, they tend to cycle off, and then you're able to replace them with individuals or elevate folks that are already there, but with individuals that are going to be a little bit more team oriented. So we've been talking a lot about team cohesion. It's a good thing, whether you're talking about for the individual performer or for the entire group. So how do we develop it? Well, it's a process like anything. So it's not going to be an is or ain't thing, right? It's going to be on a spectrum, and you're going to develop it over time. But you can do this. You can build it like a lot of the dynamics that we talk about through team building. And you're going to use what we call intervention approaches, all right? And especially for us, maybe we're talking more about organizational interventions here. Interventions come out of psychology, other forms of social science, counseling, those types of things. And oftentimes we tend to think of interventions as primarily for the individual. Maybe they have a substance abuse issue and you want to have that type of intervention. Well, that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. We're talking about more from a kind of an industrial and organizational psychology point of view, or kind of a leadership and managerial point of view, right? You want to intervene and kind of engage the organization. And team building is just one of these intervention strategies. A direct intervention approach for a particular team might be having a sports psychologist come in and really start working with the athletes and really start trying to develop the team chemistry. This is extremely effective because you're employing someone that is an expert in this area and they have a lot of tools and resources at their disposal. It's very effective, but it's less popular. And it's usually less popular because it's expensive, right? It requires resources from the team or the organization to hire a sports psychologist to come in and begin this work. Well, this work is not inexpensive, and it usually is not going to be a one-time thing. It has to happen in multiple interventions, right? You have to work with folks for a while. Most organizations just don't have the resources for it, which is why it's less popular. The indirect intervention approach is maybe you send your managers or your coaches, whatever, to meet with a sports psychologist, or maybe they attend a conference or a seminar and they get trained in some of the resources that the sports psychologist or the consultants are talking about. And maybe it's focused on team building principles and those types of things. This tends to be very popular. It tends to be a little bit less effective because, and we're not trying to impugn the coaches or the leaders that go to these professional development seminars or things like that, because that's going to be a very, very good thing. But to say that you can't get 20 years worth of experience in terms of building teams in a weekend seminar, right? So just the amount of engagement, information, and experience is going to be less, which is why it tends to be a little bit less effective. I love this example because when we think about building a team, oftentimes we talk a lot about it, and we talk about these different intervention approaches, and it tends to be within one group. Well, what if you just for a second step back and reconceptualized what the group was? And that's really what this example is about, right? Because we know we want to break down communication barriers, and we want to increase the social cohesion, and we want to make all of these environments, these professional engagement environments, less intimidating. So Kroenke Sports and Entertainment owns a number of elite professional franchises. And I think what's really kind of interesting here is there's a great diversity to the franchises that they own, the types of sport and type of work they're involved with. This is not the entire list. There are a host of other organizations that are owned by KSE, but this should just kind of give you a sense for the diversity of the folks working in these organizations. And what they do is they cross-train their employees. All right, so the individuals from one organization or sport property will go physically and train and engage in team building activities with folks from other organizations, all under the KSE umbrella. And so what they're doing is they're reconceptualizing what constitutes the team. So let's say you work for the Denver Nuggets, but then you're able to engage with someone that works in the Los Angeles Rams. All right. KSE is defining their organization as all of these, not as individual organizations per se. Or think about this. Let's say you're involved in something like Major League Soccer, but you're engaging with folks that are in the professional esports world. Not good or bad, but what it does do is it brings diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and diversity of approach, and really helps to reconceptualize how you can build a team. And that means since KSE is training all of these folks, then individuals can move from organization to organization, right? Think of it as a talent pipeline, but they've all been contained within the KSE umbrella. So a lot of these folks have the same skills regardless of whether they work in lacrosse, esports, soccer, basketball, whatever. That team is strong and the cohesion is strong, and it tends to make for a very, very pleasant working experience for the people involved.